A summer Sunday, 1914. All across Europe, the bells were pealing, calling men and women to church. Sunday, the Lord's Day, and a day of rest. It was a world of firm beliefs. The established order was not widely questioned. Father at the head of the family, the monarch at the head of the nation, God in his heaven. Sunday after church was a day of quiet pleasures.
Little Donny daydream cried of Idaho, so now you know. And when you go, you'll see there's something on her mind. Don't think it's you, 'cause no one's gonna kiss that gal but me.
In the Bois de Boulogne, the Tiergarten or Rotten Row, the aristocracy displayed themselves. Carriages, servants, dazzling clothes. Material progress had marched swiftly in the peaceful decades before 1914. It was a world of novelties, clashing with established ways. Wireless and telephones, motor cars and motorcycles, electric light and electric trains, submarines and airships. A world humming with new energy and power. But under the smiles, the relaxation, it was a world of tensions. The old order, with its economy based on land and its society based on owning land, was in conflict with the new order of industry and teeming cities. Industry had uprooted populations, expanded them beyond belief, tempted them, enriched them, and impoverished them. The peace of Europe in 1914 was a fragile thing.
On the idle hill of summer, sleepy with the sound of streams, far I hear the steady drummer, drumming like a noise in dreams.
In the Germanic empires, lying across the heart of Europe, the clash of old and new was obvious. Under the leadership of Prussia, under Bismarck, the Iron Chancellor, Germany had emerged as a nation and as a world power. In 1871, her 39 separate states, after centuries of discord, had united at last. The kings of Saxony and Bavaria, the princes, dukes and electors, Brunswick, Baden, Hanover, Mecklenburg, Württemberg, Oldenburg, all paid allegiance to the King of Prussia, the Kaiser. This unity fulfilled a deep wish in German hearts. It gave them a sense of destiny. Even the leadership of Prussia was better than insignificance. And with unity had come an extraordinary upsurge of energy and expansion. In 1871, there were 41 million Germans. In 1913, there were nearly 68 millions, an increase of more than half. And more than half of them were living in towns and cities. But it was not merely an expansion of population. The foundations of economic strength at the turn of the century were steel and coal. Germany had made great strides with both.
Steel production multiplied by 12 in 30 years.
Coal production multiplied by nearly 5 in 30 years.
Manufactures multiplied by 4.
Exports multiplied by 3.
Exports of chemicals multiplied by 3.
Exports of machinery multiplied by 5.
In 30 years, Germany's share in world trade had risen by a third. Now, in 1914, Germany was, after America, the most powerful industrial nation in the world. The epitome of her industrial might lay in the firm of Krupp. Essen, city of steel, where the first Krupp factory was built, became, by 1902,
a great city with its own streets, its own police force, fire department and traffic laws. There are 150 kilometers of rail, 60 different factory buildings, 8,500 machine tools, 7 electrical stations, 140 kilometers of underground cable and 46 overhead.
Germany delighted in the prowess of Krupps. When Alfred Krupp died in that year, the Kaiser attended his lavish funeral and called him a German of the Germans. In 1914, the firm employed 80,000 workers. They lived in Krupp houses, their babies were delivered by Krupp doctors, their children educated in Krupp schools. They bought at Krupp stores, borrowed books from Krupp libraries, married in the Krupp church, and were buried in the Krupp cemetery. Under Bismarck, Germany had come closer than any other state to modern conceptions of social welfare. German workers enjoyed sickness, accident, and maternity benefits, canteens and changing rooms, and a national pension scheme, before these were even thought of in more liberal countries. Yet the life of the workers was hard. The steel mills operated a 12-hour day and an 80-hour week. Neither rest days nor holidays were guaranteed. In Germany, as in every industrial state, there was poverty and protest. By 1912, the Socialist Party was the strongest party in the Reichstag, the German parliament. But the Reichstag did not rule Germany. The Kaiser ruled Germany through officials whom he personally appointed. No one, says Sir Winston Churchill, should judge the Kaiser Wilhelm II without asking the question, what should I have done in his position?
Imagine yourself brought up to believe that you were appointed by God to be the ruler of a mighty nation. Imagine succeeding in your 20s to the prizes of Bismarck's 3 victorious wars. Imagine feeling the magnificent German race bounding beneath you in ever-swelling numbers, strength, wealth, and ambition. And imagine on every side the thunderous tributes of the crowds and the skilled, unceasing flattery of the court.
With this background, subjected to these pressures, trying to hide a left arm withered from birth, for 30 years Wilhelm II had vexed and perturbed the peace of Europe, but always short of war. His first public utterance when he came to the throne was addressed not to the people, but to the army.
We belong to each other, I and the army. We were born for each other and will indissolubly cleave to each other. I promise ever to bear in mind that from the world above, the eyes of my forefathers look down on me, and that I shall one day have to stand accountable to them for the glory and honor of the army.
These were not empty words. The German Kaiser was also the King of Prussia, and it was precisely for the sake of Prussian strength that the other Germany, the Germany of the merchants, the industrialists, the musicians, the philosophers, had accepted her rule. The Prussian influence was seeping through the whole nation. It was above all a military influence, well described by one of its advocates, General von Hindenburg.
The army trained and strengthened that mighty organizing impulse which we found everywhere in the fatherland. The conviction that the subordination of the individual to the good of the community was not only a necessity but a positive blessing had gripped the mind of the German army, and through it that of the nation.
With Prussia as the core, the German Empire was the most powerful military organism in the world. And at its head, posturing, gesturing, stood the all-powerful Kaiser, challenging Europe.
Without Germany, and without the German Kaiser, no great decisions must ever be taken. If this should happen, the position of Germany in the world would vanish forever. And I do not purpose that this should ever happen. To employ suitable, and if necessary, violent means ruthlessly is my duty, my fair privilege.
Germany's neighbors watched her clamorous progress with alarm. The Republic of France uneasily remembered her overwhelming defeat at Germany's hands in 1870. Then the rich lands of Alsace and Lorraine had been torn from her. Patriotic Frenchmen bitterly resented the loss, and the bitterness was passed on to new generations.
Think that the motherland is your second mother, that she weeps and suffers over the children they have torn from her bosom.
France had her iron, her coal, her industry, but the French were above all tillers of the soil. The produce of her fields and vineyards made France self-supporting. The French cared for good food. The specialities of each province acquired international fame. And while the ploughland and pastures of the provinces fed Paris, Paris itself fertilized not only France, but Europe too. The curiosity and enthusiasm of Parisians matched a period which seemed to produce new novelties every day. Louis Blériot was the first man to fly the Channel.
I began my flight steady and sure. I have no apprehension, no sensations, nothing. I am making at least 42 miles an hour, traveling at a height of 250 feet. Below me is the sea. There is nothing to be seen, neither France nor England. I am alone. For 10 minutes I am lost, and then I see the cliffs of Dover.
There were flying experiments of another kind, not so successful. Cranks or pioneers, the French greeted them all expectantly. A moving pavement was displayed at the exhibition of 1900. Looking down from it, Paris was truly sovereign of cities, seemliest in sight. The wide, bustling boulevards, the cafes, the Louvre, storehouse of Europe's treasures, the imprisoned sunshine of the Impressionists, the acting of Sarah Bernard, the Moulin Rouge, and the legs of Mistinguett, dinner at Maxime's. Picasso and Matisse were painting. In her quiet laboratory, Madame Curie was discovering radium. Paris was the Mecca of the West. But Paris is not France. The glamour of Paris did not reflect the deepest truths about the French. It encouraged their optimism, but it concealed unrest and violent agitation among the industrial classes, who felt left out of a rising tide of prosperity. It concealed the backwardness of French industry in a world where this counted more and more. It concealed a declining birth rate in a world which paraded its millions. It concealed the canker at the heart of French politics, memory of the defeat of 1870, and fear of the rising might of Germany. Because of this memory and this fear, the army played a special part in the life of France. Shattered in 1870, it had made a remarkable recovery. It became a national army based on universal conscription. It schooled itself in colonial wars, but its eyes were fixed on the German frontier. In 1914, there was a socialist government. Anti-militarism, pacifism, and internationalism were being proclaimed with swelling voices.
The delegates of the workers' organizations judged that wage earners obliged to go to war have this alternative only: either to take up weapons in order to menace other wage earners, or to take up battle against the common foe, capitalism.
Anti-militarist and anti-patriotic propaganda must become ever more intense and audacious.
Discordant voices in France, strident voices in Germany. For as Germany pursued the destiny preached by her thinkers, another neighbor took fright. The Germans were not content with military might and industrial supremacy. They still felt cheated. They wanted a place in the sun, an empire. Between 1884 and 1890, German sovereignty was proclaimed over an area more than 4 times larger than Germany herself. And on the pretext of protecting these colonies and her expanding trade, Germany began to build a battle fleet. This was a threat that any British newspaper reader could understand. The sea served Britain in the office of a wall or as a moat defensive to a house against the envy of less happier lands. Now envy was reaching across the sea. Winston Churchill spoke for all Britain when he said,
"Our naval power involved British existence. If our naval supremacy were to be impaired, the whole fortunes of our race and empire would perish and be swept utterly away."
Britain awoke to the truths of the 20th century. Reality jarred against the romantic image of merry England. Yet the image lived on, reinforced by the royal family in its role of country squire. Englishmen liked to think of themselves in these terms. They attached magical virtues to walking over fields. They also found virtue in royal pageantry, jubilees, coronations, state openings, funerals. The funeral of King Edward VII in 1910 provided a last glimpse of royal Europe in all its panoply. Nine kings followed Edward's coffin through the streets of London. King George V, his successor, the Kaiser, his nephew, the King of Belgium, the King of Spain, the kings of Portugal, Denmark, Bulgaria, Norway, and Greece. The watching, awe-struck crowds were reminded that Britain was the center of an empire on which the sun never set. The most glittering jewel of all was India. The great Durbar at Delhi in 1911 seemed to set the seal on British rule.
Wearing their purple coronation robes and preceded by attendants carrying peacock fans, yak tails, and golden maces, their majesties took their thrones and faced the tens of thousands of their subjects.
King George V wrote in his diary,
the most beautiful and wonderful sight I ever saw. I wore a new crown for India, which cost £60,000. The amphitheatre contained about 12,000 people and about 18,000 troops.
"119 princes and maharajas bowed and retracted in a ceremony which lasted a full hour. The Delhi Durbar affirmed the bond between the King Emperor and more than 300 million Indian subjects. Africans, too, were subjects of the British Crown. To Cecil Rhodes had come the dream of linking British possessions with a railway from the Cape to Cairo. The almost unbroken pink up the map of Africa showed the dream well on the way to realization. And there were the white dominions, Canada, Australia, and New Zealand. These were the lands where men of British stock had driven down new routes, creating British populations in far distant places, half as numerous as the Britons who stayed at home. In the British Isles, life for many was a struggle for daily bread. The national wealth of the country in 1914 has been computed at £14,300 million. But in the black deserts of Britain's industrial towns, working class families could not afford decent clothes or enough to eat. In London at the turn of the century, 30.7% of the population were living below the poverty line. In York, 28% existed on a diet less generous than that of the workhouse. Small wonder that the Chancellor of the Exchequer, Lloyd George, wrote,
"Our working populations, crushed into dingy and mean streets, with no assurance that they would not be deprived of their daily bread by ill health or trade fluctuations, were becoming sullen with discontent."
As in Germany and in France, the workers turned to socialism. The Labour Party was born. But 40 Labour MPs could not provide a remedy. Only through the rapidly growing trade union movement could the workers assert their demands. In 1911 and 1912, Britain was swept by a wave of strikes more complete and embittered than any yet seen. The trade union leader, Ben Tillett, said,
"It was a great upsurge of elemental forces. It seemed as if the dispossessed and disinherited classes were all simultaneously moved to assert their claims upon society."
The ruling classes reacted with furious incomprehension. In Liverpool, troops were brought in to fire over the heads of the crowds. A man told Sir Austin Chamberlain,
"I think the situation's so serious that I went this morning to a wholesale armourer's to buy 5 revolvers. The shopman said, 'We had 100 yesterday. We had 50 when we opened this morning. We have not one left now.'"
This was England, facing a class struggle such as she had not seen for over half a century. Facing also the dispossessed who had nothing to do with class. The women. The old fight for women's rights received a new impetus from the militant suffragette movement.
Nothing was safe from their attacks. Churches were burned, public buildings and private residences destroyed. Bombs were exploded. The police and individuals assaulted, meetings broken up.
At Epsom, on Derby Day, a suffragette waited to throw herself under the King's horse. She died of her injuries. Workers and women. There were others, too, whose discontents were coming to a head. Southern Ireland was clamoring for home rule. Her spokesman was Eamon de Valera.
The militarist power which has kept Ireland within its grasp for centuries can never be persuaded to let go. If liberty is not entire, it is not liberty.
The Irish struggle brought Britain to the very edge of civil war. Poverty and envy, riches and arrogance, ambition and frustration, doubt and demand, these were the tensions of every industrial state. And to them were added the tensions between states themselves. In Britain, alarm grew with the growth of the German fleet just across the water. Public opinion, disunited on almost everything else, was united on the need for battleships. Each launching, whether in Barrow or in Bremen, drove Britain and Germany further and further apart. Even men as sympathetic towards Germany as Lord Haldane could say,
peace was to be preserved, but preserved on what terms? On the terms that the German was so strong by land and sea that he could swagger down the high street of the world, making his will prevail at every turn?
In 1908, Lloyd George met the German ambassador.
I explained to him that the real ground for the growing antagonism in this country towards Germany was not jealousy of her rapidly expanding commerce, but fear of her growing navy.
But the Kaiser did not care.
I do not wish for a good understanding with England at the expense of the extension of the German fleet.
So, Germany's naval dreams made Britain a potential enemy, just as her military might had kept alive the hostility of France. The two nations were drawn together by Germany's challenge. The Entente Cordiale was forged. By 1914, when King George V paid a state visit to Paris and rode with President Poincaré through cheering crowds, the Entente was 10 years old. In both countries, men welcomed the end of centuries of rivalry. It seemed a good omen for peace. But the security offered by the Entente Cordiale was delusive. For France had another ally on the other side of Europe, Russia. Britain, in turn, made an agreement with her. Thus, Germany found herself faced with what her statesmen had always most dreaded: encirclement, potential enemies in the West and in the East. In the summer of 1914, it was not Britain, nor France, nor Russia which held the real threat to the peace of Europe. The real threat lay in the alliance of Germany's making, her alliance with Austria. This was a shackle linking the swelling vigor of Germany to the irresponsible policies of an old, decaying empire. Bismarck foresaw the danger.
I shall not live to see the Great War, but you will see it, and it will start in the East.
For centuries, Austria had been the leading German state, Europe's shield against the East. By 1914, her empire was an anachronism, whose fatal ambitions died hard. At the head of this ancient realm stood the Emperor Franz Joseph, 84 years old. He had reigned in Vienna since 1848, Europe's year of revolutions, when the Austrian Empire had come near to collapse. Franz Joseph held it together by a mixture of compromise and repression, but nothing could disguise its decrepitude. Lord Lansdowne wrote,
"To human calculation, the Habsburg Empire cannot survive the decease of the Emperor Franz Joseph."
The anachronism lingered on, upheld by this old man. Its ceremonies, its displays, its brilliant uniforms, the rigid protocol of the imperial court, the high-sounding titles, the wit, the music, the culture of Vienna, all belonged to a past which was becoming ever more at odds with the present. For this empire was not merely Austrian. It was, in the first place, a dual monarchy. The Austrians shared power with the Hungarians, who kept their own parliament and their own laws. Austrians and Hungarians together ruled over a mixture of peoples. Italians, Poles, Czechs, Ruthenians, Slovaks, Slovenes, Serbs. Nearly half of Franz Josef's subjects were Slavs, who viewed their masters with sullen hatred and yearned for liberation. They looked for aid outside the Austrian Empire to the free Slav countries, the rising kingdom of Serbia and the Russian Empire, protector of Slavs everywhere. Tribal memories and tribal fears agitated all these people whose borders stretched to Europe's edge. Russia would stand by the Slavs. Against Russia, Austria would need strong help. Germany had promised that help.
Whatever comes from the Vienna Foreign Office is a command from me.
Yet there were those in Germany who felt misgivings. In 1914, the German ambassador in Vienna said,
I constantly wonder whether it really pays to bind ourselves too tightly to this phantasm of a state that is cracking in all directions.
But the Austro-German alliance was a fact, leading to inescapable conclusions. In 1914, the Kaiser noted,
As a soldier, I have no doubt, on the basis of information reaching me, that Russia is systematically preparing for war against us. And I frame my policy on that assumption.
Russia also was a troubled anachronism. The Tsar of all the Russias ruled over countless millions of people. More than 130 millions of them had been counted in the census of 1897. How many more were contained in the deep hinterlands of the Russian Empire, none could say. This was the largest state in the world, a sprawling giant. Communications across it were primitive and difficult. During the thaw, almost impossible. A British diplomat wrote,
No one can have the slightest idea what the country tracks in Russia are like during the spring and winter. It took me 16 days to traverse 80 miles.
Over these limitless distances, the Romanov dynasty, in the person of Nicholas II, emperor and autocrat, ruled absolutely. In 1895, answering a demand for more representative government, the Tsar said,
Let all know that in devoting all my strength to the people's well-being, I shall preserve the principle of autocracy as firmly and as undeviatingly as did my father.
In 1905, Russia suffered humiliating defeat at the hands of Japan. The very foundations of Tsarism were shaken. The peasants, the vast, illiterate masses of Russian people, living on a chancy borderline of famine and ruin, rose in revolution. They found allies in the growing industrial proletariat. But the 1905 revolution was bloodily crushed. In 1906, the principle of autocracy was restated by the Imperial Council more firmly than ever.
To the Emperor of all the Russias belongs supreme autocratic power. Submission to his power, not from fear only, but as a matter of conscience, is commanded by God himself.
With this imperious rejection of democracy, the regime recklessly tightened the tensions, exasperated the feelings, and embittered the thoughts of the people. There were riots and strikes. A strike in the Lena goldfields was ruthlessly suppressed. The Tsar and his court consumed their time with simple pleasures, heedless of the Russian people. Interior tensions were coming to the boil in this pious, passionate, intensely patriotic nation. And as they did so, external tensions also grew. The Balkans, where the Slav lands lay between the scowling frontiers of three crumbling empires, were their point of impact. In 1908, Austria, with outdated ambitions, annexed the Slav territories of Bosnia and Herzegovina on the borders of Serbia. Russia, still weak after defeat by Japan in 1905, let that pass. Then in 1912, the small Balkan kingdoms joined together to inflict a crushing defeat on the Turkish Empire. But they quarreled among themselves. Out of the Balkan Wars of 1912 and 1913, Serbia emerged as the strongest of the Balkan states, an inspiration for all Slavs. Austria watched her inconvenient progress with a jealous, calculating eye. The British ambassador in Vienna reported in 1913,
"Relations between Austria and Russia are growing worse day by day. Serbia will one day set Europe by the ears and bring about universal war."
The French president, Poincaré, came to a similar conclusion.
Whatever be the issue, small or great, which may arise in the future between Russia and Germany, it will not pass by like the last. It will be war.
In Austria, the issue was clear. The Austrian chief of staff, Konrad von Hotzendorf, said openly,
"We must crush this viper, Serbia."
By 1914, Europeans had learned to live with fear, and fear is the midwife of war. On Sunday, June the 28th, Europe entered upon her final, fatal crisis. The Archduke Franz Ferdinand, heir to the Austrian throne, and his wife were visiting Sarajevo, capital of the recently annexed province of Bosnia. From Serbia, just across the border, a group of Slav terrorists had also come to Sarajevo, pledged to kill Franz Ferdinand. As the Archduke and his wife took their departure, one of these terrorists, a Slav schoolboy called Gavrilo Princip, fired 2 pistol shots. They hit Franz Ferdinand and his wife. A quarter of an hour later, both were dead. The peace of Europe died with them.
For almost a century, the 1st Battalion, the Welsh Guards, has played a prominent role in the military and ceremonial life of the nation. Ian Dale from Pontypridd was just 17 years old when he joined the Welsh Guards.
Ian, for somewhere who was 6'5", he was quite a big boy. I can remember watching him trooping the colour in 1981. He was actually on the escort that trooped the colour through the ranks. I felt as if my heart was going to burst out of my chest. I was so proud of him. I was standing next to this man and spoke him and then said, "That man over there, that's my son." Yeah, I was really proud of him, really proud.
10 months later, in April 1982, Ian was told that his unit would be joining the task force to the Falkland Islands. Recently married, his wife was expecting their first child.
His attitude to us was, "Don't worry about it. All we're going to do is police the island. It's going to be another adventure." That's what he said. The army gives you adventures in your life. And he said, "This is just going to be another one for me, Mum." and I'm looking forward to it. He said, I'm married, Debbie, and I'm going to be a dad, and I'm going to have a big adventure.
Argentina invaded the Falkland Islands on the 2nd of April 1982, overpowering its tiny defence force at the capital Port Stanley, and imposing its will on a community with strong historic links to Britain. From the moment that Prime Minister Margaret Thatcher announced that she was sending a task force in response to the invasion, there was fierce competition within the armed forces to be involved in it. At their headquarters in Pirbright, Surrey, the Welsh Guards were delighted when their battalion was chosen to take part in Operation Corporate, the code name given to the task force's mission.
We had a press day before we went to the Falklands, and I was in a big bush, I remember, and the camera crew came up and said, here's one here, and I think when the camera was on, he just made it look a bit more Rambo type, I think, coming up the bush.
I do remember us all, me getting the men in three sides of a square on the barrack square in Pirbright. The boss gave his address to the nation, that I called it, and said, look, we're going and we'll take care of each other.
We sail south, quietly confident. Every soldier wishes to take part in his métier. He's trained to fight, he's trained to go on operation, and that's what he wants to do. And the whole battalion was buzzing with excitement and enthusiasm. I know that we will live up to the highest standard of our regimental traditions, whatever lies ahead.
The task force left British shores amidst scenes of patriotic fervour.
It was an exciting time. It was, because the whole country was buzzing for us to go down and recapture the Falklands, and so everybody is quite proud that we were going. It was quite a. That's what you trained for. That's not necessarily what you joined for, but the opportunity came along, and I think nobody in their right mind was going to turn it down.
The Welsh Guards travelled on the QE2, which had been requisitioned as a troop carrier.
No better way to go to war than a QE2, I suppose. It can't get better than that, but yeah, all the carpets were boarded over and certain things were protected and all that, but it was still a very nice ship.
It's nice, we go down into the cabin, somebody that pays thousands of pounds to go on there, and there we are. And eating their food as well. Not army food, proper food.
Ian Dale's family were among the crowds on the quayside at Southampton to wave him off.
It was a happy day because the bands were playing and everybody was waving and cheering, but my husband and my son were not happy because they knew that things can happen in war. But for Debbie and I, it was not going to be a problem. He was going to go out, as he told us, to police the island, and that's what he said, and that's what we believed, thankfully, because at that time I didn't know that within a very short time I would lose him.
The Falkland Islands are 8,000 miles from the UK, off the southernmost tip of South America. For the task force, it involved a 4-week journey into the unknown.
I think initially we all looked at it as a bit of an adventure, and we all thought that probably it would not result in the war that it did result in. And we thought we'd sort of set sail, get halfway down it to Ascension Island, the whole thing would be resolved, and the governments would, between themselves, resolve it, and we'd turn back and come back.
Pick a point, out to sea!
The troops travelling south spent their time in intensive training. The prospect of war still seemed a long way off.
Cock the weapon, it's not cocked, pull it right out. Recock it, come on, get it out, pull it hard. It wasn't cocked, was it, Slider?
I don't think anybody has got a sense of what it's going to really be like. It's impossible. You can't recreate it even on a training exercise. In reality, you don't know what the enemy's going to do. They do what they want to do, and you have to react.
Don't arm the weapon unless you're actually going to fire it. Okay, turn to your front, fire!
I think it really hit to me that, hang on a minute, I'm actually going to go to war, was when they give you cards to say, what do you do if you're taken prisoner? You don't get many of them on guard duty at Buckingham Palace. So when we had these cards, then I thought, well, hang on a minute, it's getting a bit serious now.
A vital component of the flotilla sent to the South Atlantic were the vessels of the Royal Fleet Auxiliary. Among them was Sir Galahad, whose job was to resupply the fighting ships with food and fuel, and to transport troops and equipment. Because the Galahad had been rushed into service with the task force, when it reached the British base at Ascension Island 2 weeks later, its cargo had to be reorganized.
A lot of the stuff that we had was wanted by other ships, and the same with the troops. So it was all moved around in a horrendous operation which lasted 4 or 5 days. We eventually sailed from Ascension Island, I think it was on the 21st of April, bound south for the Falklands.
Days later, the danger and unpredictability of the British mission was hammered home when HMS Sheffield was crippled by an Argentine missile, with the loss of 20 lives. On the 21st of May, while the Welsh Guards were still travelling south on the QE2, Sir Galahad was among the first wave of ships to take part in the British invasion of the Falklands, one of the biggest amphibious operations since the Second World War. The beachhead landing area was at San Carlos Water, and within hours of the ships arriving at the inlet, thousands of troops and tons of equipment and ammunition came ashore unopposed.
It was a beautiful morning, and the sun was coming up on all of these hills, and it's a rather nice enclosed bay of San Carlos, and reminiscent of Scotland and the islands of Scotland.
But the tranquility that greeted the task force was not to last. The ships soon came under heavy and sustained air attack, earning San Carlos the nickname Bomb Alley. It was during one of these attacks a few days later that the Galahad was hit by a 1,000-pound bomb, but luck was on her side, this time.
I was actually standing on the bridge wing. I saw it leave the aircraft, and it bounced on the water and went through the ship's side, and fortunately failed to explode. And that did actually quite a lot of damage down on the port side of the ship, knocked out all the troops' accommodation.
The Galahad was quickly patched up and put back to work resupplying ships and troops around the islands. The Welsh Guards finally arrived in San Carlos 2 weeks after the Galahad, on the 2nd of June, 1982. They were part of 5 Brigade, whose job ultimately was to attack Argentine positions in the south of the Falklands. For Guardsman Ian Dale, as for so many others arriving in a strange place on the other side of the world, thoughts turned to the folks back home.
I had a letter saying that they'd enjoyed the trip. They were looking forward to getting in and seeing what they could do to the Argies, as they call them. But they were up to their eyeballs in water. They were absolutely frozen. Their feet were soaking because they were just dug in. But he seemed quite happy. He wasn't afraid. That's the main thing. He wasn't afraid.
After 24 hours at San Carlos, and with the pressure on to retake the islands before the full onset of winter, the Welsh Guards set off to march over the Sussex Mountains to take up their forward positions in the south.
We received orders to march off and give us, to wait, just that we were moving. So everybody packed up and off we went. We'd only gone, 5 mile, something like that maybe. And then we were told to come back because we wouldn't be there in time wherever they was supposed to be.
It was just impossible to do it because of the weather conditions, because of the amount of kit and equipment we had, because the brigade commander had ordered the commanding officer to take all our equipment with us and get across there, ready to get involved in the southern fight for Stanley.
The battalion has been criticised for pathetically not being able to march across the Sussex Mountains. And I can assure you most emphatically My battalion was as fit as any battalion that fought in the Falklands War. And that I can assure you.
The overland option having failed, it was decided that the Welsh Guards would now be taken round to the south of the island aboard HMS Fearless. The plan was that they would rendezvous with 4 landing craft at a place called Lively Island, and that these would take them and their equipment into Bluff Cove. But on the night of the 6th of June, when the Fearless arrived at the agreed location, there was no sign of the landing craft. The rendezvous never took place. Commodore Michael Clapp, the senior officer in charge of amphibious operations, didn't discover the full story until years later. They'd been commandeered by a unit from the Parachute Regiment and put to use elsewhere.
The Paras wished to use the landing craft in order to reinforce their own people, so they hijacked them in order to support Tupara. I'm told that a degree of initiative like that is inevitable in war. To me, it looked like anarchy. In a way, it was, I'm afraid.
The Fearless was carrying 2 landing craft of its own, enough to transport only half the Welsh Guards to Bluff Cove. So it was decided to split the battalion. Half went ashore with Colonel Rickett. The other half returned to San Carlos, intending to complete the operation the following night.
Of course we weren't happy about it. I mean, we were a battalion, we were a fighting unit. We trained together, and I mean, the ideal solution was to land us together, and then as a unit, we'd get on with whatever task we were given.
We walked halfway to Stanley a couple of nights before, and we had to turn back. Now we've got to this point, and now we've got to turn back again. You know, I mean, frustration and disappointment set in at that point.
In fact, the success of the entire British mission was hanging in the balance. Argentine hits on important warships like HMS Antelope made Task Force Command review its strategy. It was decided that HMS Fearless shouldn't be sent on any more dangerous missions, taking troops to forward positions. And so the plans to move the Welsh Guards changed again. They were now transferred to the more vulnerable Sir Galahad, a ship the military planners were willing to risk.
It's not like you get disappointed or anything, it's just, oh well, we're doing this now, or no, we're not doing that now. Military life is, I suppose, enduring conflicts, is more of an organised chaos than anything else.
Late on the night of the 7th of June, while the Welsh Guards were asleep, the plan to reunite them with the rest of their battalion changed yet again. Sir Galahad was ordered to deliver the troops not to Bluff Cove, but to the nearby inlet at Fitzroy. It was assumed that they would march to join up with the other half of their battalion at Bluff Cove, using a bridge that had recently been repaired. But that night, nobody told the Welsh Guards aboard the Galahad of this change of plan.
It thundered round the bottom at best speed, and we'd arrived off the entrance to Fitzroy. It was just starting to get light. We could see the hills over Stanley, and it was getting them in the weather was actually lifting at the time, and so the visibility was pretty good.
Sir Galahad was now out of direct radio contact with Task Force Command back in San Carlos. As dawn broke, it was obvious that with the weather rapidly improving and very little air defense, the ship was dangerously exposed.
Well, I thought to myself, we shouldn't be on here. We should have been off at night. Didn't expect to be on any light at all. That was frightening, because you're there sitting targets and you can't do anything.
A Marines officer, Major Ewan Southby Taylor, was in charge of landing craft operations at Fitzroy. He was shocked to see the arrival of a ship packed with troops, and just after dawn, he went over to the Galahad. He said that the ship was in grave danger from Argentine air attack, and he offered the men immediate transport to the shore, a few hundred yards away.
And I put it to the senior officer that I could find on the stern of the Galahad, that my considered and professional opinion as a landing craft officer and somebody involved in amphibious warfare for almost all my career was that they should get off first and then wait. He was adamant that Bluff Cove was his destination and not Fitzroy. I was equally adamant that I was not going to take him to Bluff Cove in anything in daylight.
The fog of war had descended. It's always been assumed that the person he argued with and who refused the opportunity to get his men off the ship was Major Guy Sale, the senior Welsh Guards officer on board. Major Sale is speaking publicly about the matter for the first time in 25 years.
I did not speak to him. I know that Ewan Sotheby's Taylor said what he said. Everyone has a different memory of what was said, but I know what was said to me, and I know what I said to other people, and that's what I said to you.
Guy Sale does accept that at first he refused to get his men off the ship. But within half an hour, he had a meeting with the captain and a compromise was agreed.
The captain said to me, "I understand you're not getting off." I said, "No, not exactly. I will if you can get some orders from someone." Within half an hour, those new orders came, and they were to go in the landing craft round to Bluff Cove in 2 groups.
The problem was that there was only one landing craft and one pontoon raft at Fitzroy, and both were busy unloading another ship, Sir Tristram. By this time, the Welsh Guards had already been waiting in Fitzroy on an unprotected ship for well over an hour, and concern was mounting.
We're going through all the whys and wherefores of why we were there and what would seem a major cock-up by the planners that we were sent to a place where there were no assets to get rid of all these troops and vehicles and things that we were loaded with at the time. But it was obviously of great concern to me that we were sat there as a sitting target with all these personnel on the ship.
The headquarters of 5th Brigade, of which the Welsh Guards were a part, was just a few hundred yards away on shore. But they weren't expecting the Galahad, and they had no plan for getting the Guards off the ship.
It was a whole chapter of little accidents which, when you're 70 miles away, 80 miles away, without knowing what was going on, without able to do things, you're lost. You cannot make the right decision. You cannot say, "Stop, I won't send the Welsh Guards in with Sir Galahad." The thing starts to roll.
2.5 hours after the Galahad's arrival, the landing craft and raft were free to begin unloading. But now it was decided that a field ambulance unit should take priority over the Welsh Guards, and that was unloaded first.
Everybody knew they needed to get off this ship. We all knew we needed to get off, but we all knew we couldn't. There was no way off. You know, you couldn't swim. You couldn't swim off with all your kit. You needed transport. You needed a landing craft. So until that turned up, there was nothing else to do about it.
Many of the guardsmen were waiting on the tank deck of the Galahad, surrounded by vehicles and ammunition.
We were below decks, and we were there all day. We knew it was daylight, obviously, but we were in an enclosed space. And throughout the day, there was a case of, right, put your kit on, we're getting off, and then stand down, take your kit off, relax, we're not. And this must have happened 5 or 6 times during the day. The general feel on board the ship, the lads were playing cards, they were catching up on their sleep, you know, cleaning weapons, just the general day-to-day stuff. But you were doing this, of course, sitting on boxes of ammunition and fuel.
Finally, after 6 hours, the Welsh Guards were about to disembark. But the Galahad's luck had run out. The Argentine Air Force struck out of a clear blue sky.
There was suddenly this roar, and I looked up and saw the bottom of 5 aeroplanes, or even 6. But the first 2 had bombs coming off it that tumbled. There's a photographic image that I still got, disappearing into the hatch and a sheet of flame coming out.
The world turned orange. You get lifted as if you're a rag doll. I probably had 40, 50 pound of kit on me. And you might as well have been a feather.
I was standing here, it turned that way to look to your left where the explosion come, and fire would just hit me on the left-hand side.
The air in your body gets sucked out. It's not a case of you hold your breath, you haven't got any breath to hold. You're flying in all things. Every bone is rattling, every nerve is getting hurt.
That's all you could hear when it hit you was sort of a rushing noise. And to my left were all the mortar platoon. They took the full force of it.
I found myself in a heap of bodies, men, live men. I was on top of some people on top of me. And the heap that we were in, the higher up in the heap you were, the more burnt you were. I was very fortunate that the blokes that were in front of me took some of the blast.
I realised that we'd been hit pretty badly, and I decided that my best course of action was to get everybody out from down below onto the upper decks. And so I made a pipe on the ship's broadcast to abandon ship.
For the first 10 seconds, was panic. After that, reality sets in what's happened. And then professionalism sets in. And then everybody getting on top as fast as you can get it.
That's when they all started coming out of the doorway. Everybody was burnt, smoking, fire clothes all burnt. Well, you could see they're in a pretty bad way, and they just piling out of this door. And it was like no room, it was horrendous, really.
About 30 seconds after we got out onto the tank deck for the third time, after getting everybody up, a big explosion happened. That was the ammunition going up. That was the vehicles down there going up. And we knew when there's no going to go back down because everybody gone.
It's a horrible feeling. The very first feeling you get is, thank God it's somebody else and not you. And as soon as you think it, you regret it, because then somebody else's were your mates.
Just around the inlet at Bluff Cove, the commanding officer Johnny Rickett and his regimental sergeant major Tony Davis had no idea where the other half of their men were.
I remember very well. And the emotion comes back now. That I grabbed Tony, we got on the motorbike, and we could see this plume of smoke coming off a ship. One of two ships were actually in Fitzroy Harbour.
We didn't actually know that all our guys were on that ship when it was bombed. We didn't even know our guys were on the ship.
In my heart of hearts, when I saw that ship had been hit, I don't know if it was premonition, but I knew there were Welsh guardsmen on board that ship.
Both ships were burning, the Tristram and the Galahad. The lifeboats were taking some of the men ashore. You could say it was chaotic, but it was organised chaos in a way, because once the boys had got off the ship and once they were getting into the shore, there were lots of help. The field ambulance was ashore. They were administering first aid and, morphine and helping the guys that needed help. Lots of good things were happening, but it was pretty horrendous.
Because the injured were quickly transported to many different ships and field hospitals to be treated, it took days to establish the extent of deaths and injuries.
Friday we were told that he was missing, and it was Saturday evening, about 4 o'clock, 4:30, 5 o'clock, when the army came to the door. And that's when they said, although there is no body to prove that your son is dead, we have to assume that he is, because we cannot find him. I just said, we've lost him. I know he was missing, but I knew that we wouldn't see him again. And I looked at my husband. He couldn't speak to me, and I couldn't speak to him. And I remember he banged his head against the wall, as if he wanted to take some of the pain. But you can't take that type of pain away. It's not easy.
Six days after the bombing of Sir Galahad, on the 14th of June 1982, the Argentine forces surrendered.
Lance Corporal Anthony Burke, Lance Sergeant James Carlyle, Guardsman Ian Dale.
With the rest of the task force celebrating victory in the Falklands, the Welsh Guards returned to Fitzroy for a memorial service.
Guardsman Mark Gibby.
It was held on board the Tristram, with the Galahad still smouldering in the background.
Paul Green. Lance Corporal Nicholas David Mark Thomas.
It was a very, very moving day. I had to read the names out of the guys that were killed.
Griffiths. Guardsman Dennis Hughes.
One name in particular, it was a boy that I joined up with, and I'd been speaking to him just before I left the tank deck, and he read his name out, and a moment of real sadness that.
Guardsman Irwin Phillips. Guardsman Gareth Poole.
I knew every single one of them. We were one very close family. Commanding and being in a battalion which is in war, and it was a horrible war, although it was short, is a very, very, very special thing.
At the going down of the sun and in the morning, we will remember them.
We will remember this.
After the service, the Galahad was towed out to sea and sunk as a war grave. It seemed like the end of a tragic episode in an otherwise successful campaign.